Okay, welcome everybody to the Stanford Department of Psychology's inaugural public lecture. My name is Jamil Zaki. I'm an associate professor here in the department and also chair of our brand new Media and Outreach Committee. Our committee's mission is simple. We believe psychological research is relevant to everyone, and we'd like to give as many people as possible a chance to learn about insights coming from the field of psychology. To that end, we're working on lots of different activities, including an e-newsletter that people can sign up for to learn about new activities and insights from our department, and of course, this public talk series. And I want to extend a special thanks to our chair, Anthony Wagner, and many members of our department who have supported these activities. So for today's event, we'll hear from our amazing speaker, my colleague Jennifer Eberhardt. I'll then join Jennifer on stage for a short conversation, which will include your questions. So we're lucky today to be joined by a number of volunteers, including Jose Luis Gondora, who's our Media and Outreach Committee intern, as well as several members of the Stanford Undergraduate Psychology Association. So after the talk, they will come through the aisles with cards. And if you have a question, you can raise your hand and write it down, and they'll come pick it up and deliver it to me. So we won't probably have a chance to get through all of your questions, but we'll hope to hit some key points. And then after our conversation, Jennifer will be available in the lobby to sign books. I just honestly can't think of anyone better to launch this series than Jennifer Eberhardt. It's my privilege to have her as a colleague, and it's my privilege to introduce her now. Dr. Eberhardt received her BA from the University of Cincinnati and her PhD from Harvard before doing postdoctoral work here at Stanford, teaching at Yale, and then coming back to Stanford, where she is now Morris M. Doyle Centennial Professor of Public Policy and Professor of Psychology. Among her many accolades, far too many to name now, because that would take as long as her talk, Dr. Eberhardt has been elected to the National Academy of Sciences and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and named a MacArthur Fellow. The great psychologist Kurt Lewin said, "There's nothing so practical as a good theory," and I think Jennifer's work really embodies this principle. Throughout her career, she has used an array of cutting-edge methods to produce a deep, unblinking look at the way bias shapes everything, from what we see to how we treat people, and how that in turn creates inequity and injustice in education, law enforcement, and beyond. This could be a bleak picture in some people's hands, but Dr. Eberhardt has turned it into action. She's brought her insights to all sorts of people, from teachers to corporate leaders to police officers and lawyers and filmmakers and all sorts of others, with the hopes that by demonstrating and understanding bias, we can begin to fight it. Her research is an inspiring reminder that knowledge can be a powerful step towards positive change. I think hers is a message we need now more than ever. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Eberhardt.
Thank you. Thank you for such a kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me to be the first speaker of this series, and thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. Now, it's February, and given that this is Black History Month, I'd like to treat this time as a time of reflection. As a nation, how did we get to this point, and what can we do to move forward? Just recently, the Pew Research Center released a report showing that 6 in 10 Americans believe that race relations in this country are generally bad. And a majority of Americans feel that things are getting worse. They fear that we're slipping back in time. As a nation, we're struggling to hang on, and I wrote this book, Bias, to begin to speak to that struggle. I wrote this book to bring the science of bias to everyday people, to enlist science in our fight for equal justice, to encourage progress, to offer hope. And so I'm here tonight to talk about bias, and although we can have biases about all sorts of groups, based on all sorts of characteristics, I want to focus here on race. When the average person thinks of racial bias, they think of burning crosses and people filled with hate. They think of old-fashioned racism. But I'm a social psychologist, and as social psychologists, we know that you don't have to be an old-fashioned racist to be biased. Bias can be triggered and can have devastating impact, even when we're not aware of it, even when we claim that it's our intention to be fair, even when in fact it is our intention to be fair. So during my time here tonight, I want to demonstrate how racial disparities across a variety of contexts can inspire bias in many people, including us. And that bias can work to sustain and magnify the disparities that are already there. So the first part of my presentation, I want to focus on how bias functions across systems. And for the second part, I'm going to offer tools for disrupting the bias that we see. Now, as an example, I'm going to use the black-white dynamic here quite a bit, where the research is most advanced, at least in psychology, and where the disparities are especially extreme, and where those extreme disparities seem to exist in almost every facet of life. So let's take a tour. We're going to take a tour of empirical studies, starting with those studies most relevant to the criminal justice system. Although African Americans make up less than 13% of the US population, they make up nearly 33% of the prison population. And that disparity biases us. It changes how we see. And at the root of this process is the stereotypic association between African Americans and crime. With a number of colleagues, I've conducted many studies to demonstrate the power of this association. And we found that this association of blackness with crime is so strong that it can determine which objects we see in the world and which we don't. African Americans are so associated with crime that the mere presence of a black face can cause us to see weapons better. So to examine this, I want to give you an example. We invited undergraduates into our laboratory to participate in a study, and we had them sit in front of a computer screen with the focus dot at the center. And then they saw these flashes of light appear around that focus dot. Now, these flashes were actually the faces of young men that were appearing on the computer screen at such a rapid rate that participants couldn't consciously detect them. So here it is, again, the same thing in slow motion. So we use what's called a subliminal priming procedure to expose some of our participants to a whole series of black faces. We had another group of participants and we exposed them to a whole series of white male faces. And then we had a third group of participants who were not exposed to any faces at all. And then after this procedure, we asked those same participants, all of them, to perform a sort of supposedly unrelated object recognition task. And for this task, they were presented with a series of objects that were severely degraded. And these objects appeared on the computer screen one at a time. And each object was slowly brought into focus in a series of 41 steps or 41 frames. Now, the participants' goal was to indicate with a button push the moment at which they could recognize what that object was. Now, some of these objects were crime relevant, like guns and knives, and some of them were crime irrelevant, like cameras and staplers and so forth. And we hypothesized that participants primed with black faces, so these are participants who were simply exposed to black faces, that they would be better at recognizing the crime objects. So what did we find? So first we're going to look at what happened with the crime irrelevant objects. And just to orient you here, on the vertical axis, we have the frame number at which participants could recognize what the object was. And that's going from frame 1, where it's completely blurry, to frame 41, right, where it's completely clear. And first, we're going to look at what happens for people's recognition of these crime irrelevant objects. And we can see here that exposure to white faces or black faces beforehand doesn't make any difference for their recognition of those objects, right? They're recognizing those objects at about the same point on the continuum, at about the midpoint of the continuum. Now, when we look at what happens with the crime-relevant objects, we get a pattern that's altogether different. After simple exposure to black male faces, participants all of a sudden need fewer frames to tell us what those objects are. They need less information. They need less clarity. Right away, they could say, that's a gun or that's a knife. Now, we can't celebrate Black History Month without invoking the words of Dr. Martin Luther King. What would King say? Well, he once said, everything that we see is a shadow cast by that which we do not see. It was the black faces which people weren't even aware of, right, that led them to see the weapons more clearly. And we get just the opposite effect with exposure to white faces beforehand. People need more clarity. They need more information before they could say, oh, that's a gun or that's a knife. So exposure to black faces facilitated their detection of the crime objects, whereas exposure to white faces inhibited their detection of those very same objects. Now, this particular study was conducted with both white and non-white study participants, and we found that the race of the participant made no difference, right? We get the same pattern of results regardless of the participant's race. Now, on the next stop of the tour, we're going to take a look at how this association of blackness with crime can influence how we act, and in particular, our decision to shoot. So here, I want to talk about research that was conducted by Josh Carell and colleagues. And some years ago, they designed what they called a shoot, don't shoot computer simulation. And in this computer simulation, participants saw a series of people, and each person was either holding a gun or holding a harmless object. And they were told, if you see someone holding a gun, push a button labeled shoot, right? And do this as quickly as possible, right? If you see someone holding a harmless object, push a button labeled don't shoot, right? Now, I want to give you a sense of what it's like to be in a psychology study. I want to immerse you in the experience here, right? So I have a number of the slides that these researchers used in the study, and I'm going to show them to you. And if you see someone holding a gun, I want you to use your right hand to tap as quickly on your lap, as quickly as you can for shoot, because there's a gun. And if you see a harmless object, I want you to use your left hand to tap as quickly as possible for don't shoot. Okay, so it's right for shoot and left for don't shoot. Okay, you ready? Are you up to the task here? All right, let's give it a go. All right, so I want to explain something to you before we move on here, and that's just that, you know, the object of this task is to move quickly, right? That's the whole point, right? You gotta react fast, right? So I'm gonna show you some more of these images. There are practice effects here, so you'll get better. And so I want you to react quickly, and I want you to slap your lap loudly so we can kind of hear what's happening in the room. All right, you ready? All right, let's try it again. Much better. So careful there. That's a cell phone. That's an old-fashioned flip phone, right? So one of the dangers of not keeping up with the technology, right? So, all right, let's keep going. Okay, so the researchers had study participants do this about 80 times, and they found that on average, people were faster to shoot a black person with a gun than they were to shoot a white person with a gun. And they also found that study participants were more likely to mistakenly shoot a black person who held no gun than they were to mistakenly shoot a white person who held no gun. And these effects have been replicated now by different researchers in different regions of the country. And not only do you get these results with students, but Josh Carell and others have found these same results with community members as study participants. So similar to what I was, with the initial study that I talked to you about, it seemed that who the participant is doesn't seem to matter. And this association of blackness with crime makes its way into the courtroom as well. It can also affect who we punish. It can even influence death sentencing decisions. In a large data set of death-eligible defendants, we found that looking more black more than doubled the chances that those defendants would receive a death sentence, at least when their victims were white. And this effect was significant even though we controlled for factors like aggravators and mitigators, and we controlled for the severity of the crime, and we even controlled for the defendant's attractiveness. But no matter what we controlled for, right, no matter what we took into account, black defendants appear to be punished in proportion to the blackness of their physical features. The more black, the more death-worthy. And this association between blackness and crime not only affects how we perceive faces, it can also affect how we perceive body movement. And how we perceive body movement also matters in the context of crime. Police officers base their suspicions of criminal wrongdoing in part on body motion. So at the next stop of the tour, I want to present a study that was designed to answer a simple question, and that is, to what extent is race related to how officers read body motion? So this time, we conducted an archival study that involved data collected by the NYPD on their stop and frisk practices. Now, each time an officer stops someone on the streets of New York City, they're required to complete a form. And on that form, officers have to indicate why it is they made the stop. So you see here, there are a number of reasons to make a stop, including what they call furtive movement. So what is furtive movement? So it turns out the department didn't know. There was no agreed upon definition of what furtive movement was. And so that left it to officers to decide for themselves what kind of movement was furtive or suspicious. And officers could do this in different ways, and they could make these determinations in different ways in different parts of the city, right? So our question here was simple. It was, how is race related to how officers are making these determinations about furtive movement? Now, in 2010, during the peak of stop and frisk, New York officers made over 600,000 stops, and over 300,000 of those stops were based on furtive movement. It was by far the #1 reason people were stopped on the streets of New York City. So to a big extent, officers were using body motion as a cue to threats or danger or criminal activity. And when we just focused on white and black people who were stopped for furtive movement during the peak of stop and frisk, 88% were black and 12% were white. Next, we looked at racial disparities in treatment after being stopped for furtive movement. And we found that Black people were more likely to be frisked than white people. They were more likely to be subjected to physical force, though they were no more likely to have a weapon. In fact, only 1% of those stopped for furtive movement actually had a weapon. 1%. Pretty low hit rate, right? Now, despite all of this, most New Yorkers supported aggressive stop and frisk practices at the time. Why is this? So in follow-up studies, we found that the more people were reminded of racial disparities in the criminal justice system, so for example, the more Black they thought the prison population was, the more they thought that these aggressive practices were necessary to keep order and to stay safe. And this has real implications. Social activists will often use extreme racial disparities as an indication that the system is broken, right? And as a motivator, right, for us to push harder for reforms. Yet because of the racial narratives we have that link Black people to inherent criminality, those very disparities can be seen as proof that Blacks are criminal, right? Those very disparities can be seen as evidence that the system is working fine. Now, I want to pause here before moving on to the next stop on the tour, and I want to take a little break from the data and from the studies, and I want to tell you a story. Some years ago, I was on a plane with my son, and he was about 5 years old at the time. And my son was so excited about being on this airplane with Mommy. He's like looking around, he's checking everything out, he's checking the people out. And he sees this guy and he says to me, "Hey, that guy looks like Daddy." And I look at the guy, and he doesn't look anything at all like my husband, nothing at all, right? So then I start to look around on the plane, and I noticed he was the only Black guy on the plane. And I thought, okay, I'm gonna have to have a little talk with my 5-year-old about how not all Black people look alike, right? So I'm getting ready to have the talk, right? And sort of getting the lecture together in my head and trying to make it appropriate, right, for a 5-year-old. But before I started to lecture him, you know, it dawned on me that children see the world in a different way from adults, right? They haven't been conditioned year after year to see people in certain ways. And I thought, well, maybe there is some resemblance, you know, that my son is seeing that I can't see between, you know, this man and my husband. And I thought, okay, I'm gonna give it a shot. So I look at this man and I'm looking for any resemblance to my husband. I look at his height and there's no resemblance there. He was about 4 inches shorter than my husband. And I look at his weight and no resemblance there. I look at his facial features, nothing. I look at his skin color, nothing. And then I look at his hair. And this man has long dreadlocks flowing down his back. And my husband shaves his head. And I thought, all right. I look at my son and I'm like, you're gonna get the talk, right? So I'm all ready to give him the talk. But before I could say anything, my son, he looks up at me and he says, "I hope he doesn't rob the plane." And I said, "What? What did you say?" And he said it again. He says, "Well, I hope that man doesn't rob the plane." And I said, "Well, why would you say that? You know Daddy wouldn't rob a plane." And he said, yeah, I know. And I said, "Well, why would you say that?" And he looked at me with this really sad face and he said, "I don't know why I said that. I don't know why I was thinking that." We're living with such severe racial stratification that even a 5-year-old can tell us what's supposed to happen next. Even with no malice, right? Even with no hatred, right? This association between blackness and crime made its way into the mind of my 5-year-old. It makes its way into the minds of all of our children and to all of us. My son lives in California. He lives in a state where less than 6% of the population is black, yet nearly 30% of those incarcerated are black. And those disparities have broad reach. They not only affect how we see black men, they affect how we see their children. Even 5-year-olds are caught in the grip. In a recent study by Andrew Todd and colleagues, they found that people associate the faces of black kindergartners with crime. In a laboratory study, they asked people to look at a computer screen and to simply categorize the objects they were seeing as guns or toys. Now, they also saw children's faces, which they were told to simply ignore. Right? So let me give you a little demo of what this looks like. You see a child's face, you're told to ignore that face and to say whether that object was a gun or a toy. Gun or toy, gun or toy, gun or toy. And they found that mere exposure to black children's faces led participants to identify those guns more quickly. Bias can move from the prisons to the streets. It can seep into our schools. It can shadow our children as they learn. So our next stop on the tour is the schoolhouse. Here, I want to focus on how race might influence how teachers discipline their students. There are racial disparities in the schooling context as well. Black students are more than 3 times as likely to be suspended or expelled than white students. And close to 70% of those black students who are pushed out of school end up in the criminal justice system at some point in their lifetimes. 70%. And minor infractions are a big reason why teachers discipline their students. But to what extent are the disparities that we see in the schooling context due to racial bias, right? As opposed to the possibility that black children are just misbehaving more so than other children. So to isolate the causal role of race in all of this, we conducted an online study with practicing teachers in different regions of the country. And we asked those teachers to simply imagine teaching at a middle school. And we asked them to read the office referral records of a student who had misbehaved in some benign way. So for example, they read about a student who was strolling around class and getting tissues out of a tissue box, right, and kind of disrupting the class in this way. Now, half of our teachers read about a student named Greg who misbehaved in this way. So this is a student with a stereotypically white name. And the remaining half read about Darnell, a student with a stereotypically black name who behaved in this identical way. So this change in names was our race manipulation. And we found that initially the race of the student didn't matter, right? It didn't influence how teachers viewed the infraction. For example, the teachers were no more irritated or hindered by the student's misbehavior, when he was presented as black. And then also race had no impact on how they felt that child should be disciplined. But then they read that the same student misbehaved again. This time they read that Greg was sleeping in class and you tell him to wake up and he doesn't wake up and he's not doing his work. Or they read that Darnell misbehaved in this way. And here we get huge race effects. The teachers see Darnell's behavior as more problematic, right, as more disrupted. They feel more irritated with Darnell, and they want to discipline him more. And not only do they want to discipline him more in the moment, they can more easily imagine suspending him down the road. So why is this? So we conducted follow-up studies to try to understand what was going on here. And we found that when it came to Greg, the teachers were more inclined to see the two infractions as isolated incidents. One had nothing to do with the other. But for Darnell, those incidents were related, right? They were indicative of a pattern of misbehavior that was problematic, right? And that needed to be shut down. And so that's why we're getting the effects that we're getting here. So after just 2 strikes, right, 2 incidents, they saw Darnell as a troublemaker. And this starts early. For example, when researchers at Yale told preschool teachers to watch for children who might cause trouble, they looked at the Black children. They showed teachers a video of children sitting around a table and playing with toys. No one was in fact causing trouble. Yet using eye tracking equipment, they found that the teachers were looking at the Black students for signs of trouble. And they looked at the Black boys in particular. So it starts early, and it has real implications for the mental well-being of Black students and for their ability to achieve in school. You know, over time, those students worry about how they might be treated in the school environment, and those concerns can affect their day-to-day interactions with teachers, and those concerns can affect their identity as learners. And when those children grow up, right, and they enter the workplace, what problems do they face? For the final stop of our impact tour, I want to look at the workplace. In a now classic study, 2 economists, Bertrand and Mullinatham, examine the role of race in hiring decisions in the U.S. labor market. And so they were looking at entry-level positions here for the most part, like sort of positions as sort of like sales positions and parking attendants and office clerks and things like that. And they developed 5,000 resumes, and they systematically varied the race of the applicant. And they sent these resumes around to lots of employers, right, who were advertising for jobs in Boston and in Chicago. And they found that those resumes with the Black-sounding names received 50% fewer callbacks from potential employers than those resumes with the white-sounding names. And this particular study was conducted way back in 2004, but these results have held up over time. In a recent meta-analysis that examined studies like this that have been conducted over the past 25 years, we see from that meta-analysis that African Americans and Latinos continue to receive fewer callbacks. And these results are not limited to the US. Researchers have found these same effects with all kinds of disfavored groups in Australia and in Canada and across Europe. Even students from elite US colleges are concerned about bias in the labor market. Researchers have shown that many African Americans and Asian students will attempt to whiten their resumes to appear more acceptable to employers. So for example, J. Anthony Smith becomes, I'm sorry, I should say, that's funny, that's a Freudian slip there, I think. Jamal Anthony Smith becomes J. Anthony Smith, right? And Black students will even try to downplay, their identity by removing it, from the activities that they were involved in college. And sometimes they remove the activities altogether. Even though they risk not getting credit for the skills they picked up engaging in those activities, they feel like it's an even bigger risk, right, to present themselves as too Black or as too radical. And get this, the researchers found that their concerns are warranted. Whitened resumes do indeed receive more callbacks than unwhitened resumes. And this is the case even for employers who state that they care about diversity and inclusion. And it doesn't end there. If they get the interview, they risk having shorter, less positive interviews. If they get the job, they risk not being promoted. And many will end up leaving only to enter a new environment where the same old issues play out all over again. So their potential goes untapped, right? As the world looks on to see the lack of diversity in the C-suite as indicative of who truly deserves to be on top. Everything that we see is a shadow cast by that which we do not see. Bias and concerns about bias are even present when it comes to what businesses people invest in. In fact, with Lumen Capital, a private investment firm, we've begun looking at the causal role race could play in investment decisions. So to examine this, our study participants were professional investors, and we presented these investors with one-page descriptions of highly qualified venture capital teams who could help them to manage their investments. And we used photographs to depict the managing partner of each team as either Black or as white. And we found that the investors evaluated the highly qualified Black-led teams more negatively in terms of their track record, in terms of their expertise, in terms of their ability, right? Now, one of the most common claims that you hear in this industry is that there's a pipeline problem. There are just not enough people of color who are in the industry who are showing up. But we're finding that this lack of diversity in the investment industry may not only be a pipeline problem. It's not just that it's hard to find these highly qualified Black-led venture capital teams. Those teams are out there, and when they show up, they face barriers. In fact, we're finding that the more qualified the Black-led teams are, the more barriers they face. When we look at who is in the investment industry, the racial and gender disparities are about as extreme as you can get. And the question is, how do these disparities feed bias? How might these disparities influence the evaluation of pitches? Who looks too risky? Who looks investment worthy? So in this space too, disparity can be self-perpetuating. So what do we do? What do we do when racial bias is all around us, right? It's in our workplaces, in our schools, in our police departments, in our courtrooms. What do we do? I want to argue that although racial bias can touch our lives in so many ways, we're not doomed to be under its grip. We're all vulnerable to bias, but we don't act on bias all the time. Instead, bias is triggered by the situations we find ourselves in. As researchers, we know a lot about what those situational triggers are. So for example, responding quickly is a trigger for bias. When you don't have a lot of time to think, right? It forces us to rely on these well-practiced, these sort of automatic associations that we've built up over time, and those associations kind of leap forward and can infect our decision-making. So remember, we went through that whole shoot, don't shoot demonstration, right? And I was pushing you to go quickly, and I was pushing you to go quickly because that's where you see the bias. If you have all day to look to see, is that a gun or is that a cell phone, right? You don't see bias there. It's when you have to act quickly. Subjective standards, when we're using subjective standards to evaluate others rather than objective standards, you see bias. right? Furtive movements, right? The NYPD officers were evaluating criminality, right? Wrongdoing based on the subjective standard of furtive movements that they couldn't define, right? It was subjective. And so now, because of this, and also because stop and frisk was ruled unconstitutional, they've taken that off the form. I mean, so you can't actually, they can't pull people over in New York City solely for the reason of sort of this furtive movement anymore. And lack of accountability, that's another trigger for bias. Lack of training, lack of positive contact. Even our emotional states can trigger bias. When we're feeling threatened or fearful, for example, bias is more likely to come alive. Cultural norms, that's a big one, right? If we're in a social environment where there aren't sort of really strong egalitarian values, that moves us in a direction of bias, even if our own values are counter to that. And that's because we're social beings. Our social environment affects us even when we're not aware of it. Now, I focus quite a bit on African Americans here, but these situational triggers are at work regardless of the group that is targeted by bias. And they're at work not only within us as individuals, they're at work within the systems that we build. And so let me give you an example here. How many people are familiar with Nextdoor, this tech company? A lot of people, okay. Well, you know, their whole purpose, right, is to offer this online platform where they can use that platform to create stronger and healthier and safer communities, right? So they want to offer that platform as a place where neighbors could gather and share information. Now, you could share information about all sorts of things, right? Like if you have a good plumber, or if you're in need of a tutor, or in my neighborhood, get a lot of messages about coyotes, right? And that could be important. I don't have any pets, but if you have a pet, you'd want to know if there was a coyote roaming the neighborhood, right? But they soon discovered, though, that they had a problem. They had a problem with racial profiling on the platform. And in the typical case, people would look out the window and see a black man in an otherwise white neighborhood and report him as suspicious, even when there was no evidence of criminal wrongdoing. So the co-founder of Nextdoor, Sarah Leary, she reached out to me and she reached out to others to try to figure out what to do. And she poured through the literature. You would be happy with this. She poured through the social psychological literature to try to find any, sort of clues about how to combat racial profiling. And she found, or they found, I should say, that in order to combat this, you would need to slow people down. Now, this presented its own problem for them, right? Because they're a tech company. And tech companies, you're all about developing these products where you're speeding people up, right? You want to reduce friction, right? So you want to have these products out there that people can use quickly and intuitively, and where they don't even have to think, right? But these are the very conditions under which bias comes alive. So they had to take a gamble here. To intentionally add friction in the world, in an industry where friction is a bad word, and they wanted to slow people down. So how did they do that? So it used to be the case that when you saw someone suspicious, you would hit the crime and safety tab on the side, and you could just shout out right away to the neighbors, suspicious person, right? Sometimes you call the police and be a lot of chatter about it, right? But now, when you hit that crime and safety tab, there's a checklist that pops up, and there are 3 items on that checklist. And the first item is, what is it about this person's behavior that's making him suspicious, right? So it can't be suspicious black man, which is what was happening before, right? It can't be your social category that's making you suspicious. What is he doing? And then the second item on that checklist was for them to describe that person's individual features rather than simply his social category. And then the third item, which is one that surprised me, is that they discovered that a lot of people using the platform did not know what racial profiling was, nor did they understand that they were engaging in it, right? So the third item offers a definition of what profiling is, and it lets them know that it's prohibited on the platform. Now, you all have seen, those signs in airports, right? If you see something, say something. So they were trying to modify this so that it's, if you see something suspicious, say something specific. So that's what they were going for. And they found that slowing people down, just adding this friction, they were able to reduce racial profiling by over 75% on the platform. So how might you add friction to your environment, right? People often say to me, but you can't add friction to any context, right? So, you have people who are overworked, or for people who have challenging caseloads, or for people who are having to make these split-second decisions. You can't add friction there. But it turns out you can add friction to more situations than we think. Working with the Oakland Police Department here just across the bay, I and a number of colleagues were able to help the department to reduce the number of stops they made of people who were not committing any serious crimes. And they did this by simply forcing officers to ask themselves a question before each and every stop they made. And that question was, is this stop intelligence-led, yes or no? Right? So what do they mean by intelligence-led? Well, it turns out they didn't know either, right? So the department did not have an agreed-upon definition of what intelligence-led meant, but they would use that term all the time to describe what they were doing and why they were stopping people. And so the department had to figure out, okay, what's going to be the definition? And so the definition for Oakland is that, did you have prior information, right? Did you have prior intelligence that would link this particular person to a specific crime? And then if the answer to that question is yes, you had to state the source of that intelligence. Now, by simply adding that checkbox to the form officers complete during a stop, they slow down, right? They pause. They think, why am I, thinking of pulling this person over? So in 2017, Oakland officers made almost 32,000 stops. In 2018, with the addition of this Intel-led box, they made roughly 19,000 stops. And African American stops alone fell by 43%. And this drop happened even as the crime rate continued to fall. So how does this intervention work? Well, we slowed them down. We changed the standard that they were using to evaluate others, so pushing them to use evidence of wrongdoing in place of intuition. We increased accountability by introducing a metric to track Intel-led stops. And then the department defined what an Intel-led stop was and then trained officers on how to spot it. And then the police leadership incentivized these stops. So not only do we have individual tools at our disposal to curb bias, we can package these tools in different ways. We can package them together to produce better outcomes. Okay, so what about police officers who do stop people? How might those interactions be influenced by race? So I've been working with an interdisciplinary team of researchers here at Stanford to address this very question. And we're doing this by looking at the footage from body-worn cameras. And we're using machine learning techniques to analyze the words officers are using with community members in nearly 1,000 traffic stops. And we're finding that officers are less respectful to black drivers than white drivers in both subtle and not so subtle ways. And in fact, in our study, we found that based on the words officers used alone, we could predict whether that officer is talking to a black driver or a white driver. So with encouragement from the community, the department asked us to present the takeaways of our findings in a police training on traffic stops. And we're now looking at the body-worn camera footage of these officers pre and post training to see whether that training made a difference in real interactions on the street. Now, oftentimes you get trainings where, the training happens and you don't quite know what's going on, the training's not evaluated. I'm finding that to the extent that the training is evaluated in a lot of these spaces, it's did you like the training, right? So it's not the actual metric that we're really interested in, right? So what we wanted to do is to go right to the heart of it, right? So we have this training where we're trying to intervene, right, on these interactions on the street to improve those interactions. And so we're now looking at that footage post-training to see if that training had that effect. Okay, in the domain of education, researchers have found that slowing teachers down and training teachers to be more empathetic to their students when they misbehave can reduce the suspension rate. And they do this by redirecting teachers to broaden their focus. And so I don't know if Greg Walton is here or not, but this is some of the work that he's done with a former PhD student here at Stanford, Jason Okwanifa. And so in this intervention, they're trying to help teachers to think about, what is leading to the misbehavior, right? So to look past, the misbehavior in the moment to try to think what's producing it, right? And so teachers learned about all kinds of experiences and worries that could lead a child to feel, mistrust and to therefore misbehave. And then teachers provide examples of how they could discipline a child in a manner that would convey concern for that child, in a manner that could pull that child into the community rather than pushing them further away. So this is an intervention that's grounded in the science of relationship building, and using this simple technique, these researchers were able to cut the suspension rate in half. Now, I've been working with some of those same researchers now to develop an intervention for high school students who've been pushed into the juvenile justice system, and they're now attempting to return to high school. And for this intervention, we get students now, so here we're focused on students, and we get them to think about their values and to think about what they would want to achieve at school right at the point of their reentry. And we ask them to name an adult who they feel could be supportive of them. And we then ask the students what they would want that trusted adult to know about them. And for half of the students, we write a letter to that trusted adult, telling them about the student's reentry. And in the student's own words, we share what that student wanted that adult to know about them. So what happened? We found that about 70% of the students who were not in our intervention went back to juvenile detention. And we found that 64% of those students who got the intervention also went back to juvenile detention. But for those who got the intervention and that trusted adult actually received the letter, right? They were introduced to this child, and they were told that this child selected you, right, to look after them. This child wants you to know these various things about them and to help them through this reentry. Only 29% of those students recidivated. So those students, despite their hopes and dreams, needed help to re-enter. They needed the power of one adult, right? Just one adult in that system to guide them and shield them and believe in them. So we tried this as a pilot study initially with a small sample of just 47 students in Oakland, and now we're trying to scale it up. And the plan is to try it in different school communities in different regions to see if the results hold. So we want justice. We want fairness. We want change. And King reminds us that change comes through continuous struggle. He says, every step toward the goal of justice requires sacrifice, suffering, and struggle. The tireless exertions and passionate concern of dedicated individuals. So you ask, what can we do? We now know that we have many mitigation tools at our disposal. Not only to fight bias, we have tools we can use to fight the mere threat of bias. We have tools we can use to repair broken relationships. And we can use these tools in our own individual lives, in our institutions, our police departments, our workplaces, our schools, our courtrooms, right? Can use these same tools to make sure that everyone in the system is protected. There's a lot of power in just the simple things. And we want to keep up the fight at this level, even as we take aim at the harder things. As a nation, we want to take aim at the racial narratives that keep people anchored at the bottom of society. We want to take aim at the structural disparities that those narratives produce and reflect. And that's a much heavier lift. Yet in this too, we all can take part. In this book, I take everyday people on a journey. And everywhere they go, readers not only discover scientific ideas about the human mind and how bias works and what it all means, they meet people. They meet people who are struggling and fighting. They meet people like Tiffany Crutcher, whose twin brother was shot and killed by a police officer in Tulsa, Oklahoma several years ago. Tiffany responded to the pain of that by dedicating her life to police reform. They meet Bernice Donald, who was one of a handful of black students to desegregate an all-white high school in Olive Branch, Mississippi in the 1960s. She endured horrific discrimination from students and teachers alike. Yet she emerged as the first black woman in the entire state of Tennessee to serve as a judge. And she later was appointed to the U.S. Court of Appeals. They meet Campbell, a white Southerner, a student at the University of Virginia, who went to battle with white supremacists on the streets of Charlottesville. They came to town to start a race war. Yet there Campbell stood, defending the campus, defending the town, defending the egalitarian values that this country is still striving to embrace. Readers meet these people and more, and regular people, right? Regular people who are rising up to do extraordinary things. So it's about time for me to leave the podium. But before I do, I want to leave you with one final story, okay? This is a story about my own experience. It's about my own attempt to contribute. So I was an instructor at San Quentin State Prison, and I'd been at Stanford at that point for about 12 years. But there I stood in front of a class at San Quentin for the very first time. It was a small class of about 30 students or so. And just as I had done for years at Stanford, on that first day of class, I asked the students to introduce themselves and to say why it is they wanted to take the class. Now, some of their responses were similar to what I heard from Stanford students. So, for example, they thought the course would be interesting, or they needed the credit to fulfill the requirement. That happens here, right? Yet I also heard reasons for taking the course that I'd never heard before. For example, one man told me that he was worried that his daughter was depressed. And he thought that maybe by taking a psychology course, he would be able to help her, he would be able to support her, right, in her time of need. Then another man spoke. This man was in his mid-40s. And he said to me, I'll never forget this, he said to me, I already know a lot about how things work here inside San Quentin. And he says to me, I'm taking this class because I want to know how free people think. He had been incarcerated since he was 14 years old. He'd spent his entire adult life behind bars, and he was desperate to understand how that imprisonment had warped his view of the world. And I was standing before him, right, shackled by the perceptions of a society that would discard a 14-year-old. And it struck me that we were both there to move a little closer to freedom. And since that time, it struck me that so many of us are trying to move closer to freedom. So this book attempts to chart a path forward. I'd like this book to contribute to the conversations we're having about race and inequality in this country right now, so that we don't slip back in time, so that we remain hopeful, so that we continue to strive to see other people, and so that we continue to strive to see ourselves. Thank you. I'm going to end on that note. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for that absolutely phenomenal talk. Just a point of order for everyone. We now have some volunteers who will be coming through the aisles. So if you have questions and you'd like a note card, please indicate that to them, and then they'll come back just a minute later to collect those questions and then hand them to me. But I have some questions in the meantime, like a million. I mean, it was just so devastating and hopeful at the same time to hear about your phenomenal work and your own perspective on it. I have to say, lots of questions as a psychologist and a scientist and a person, but my first question to you is as a parent. Your story about being with your son on that plane was just so, it was just heartbreaking. And, as the parent of a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, I think about this all the time.
Yeah.
How do we talk with our kids about bias? I mean, our colleague, Stephen Roberts, his work suggests that, hey, they have biases. You've shown us that teachers and adults have biases when they look at our kids. How do we talk with kids in a way that is clear and unflinching and honest, but also doesn't leave them hopeless?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, it's a question that a lot of people are concerned about. I mean, raising a child, who doesn't have bias, right? But also raising a child who could be a potential target of bias. I mean, it's a huge, huge issue. Actually, it's something that our colleague Stephen Roberts and I are starting to do work on. It's a problem that a lot of people are trying to figure out, well, what do we do? How do we talk to our children about race? And I think also that a lot of parents feel like, well, it's better to just not talk to them about race, right? They're too young, if they're 4, if they're 5, like how do you don't want to have that conversation, and you want to protect their innocence, and you want to sort of, just shield them as long as you can. But the research doesn't bear that out, right? Sort of having this kind of colorblind approach to these things, even for young children, the research doesn't bear it out. So, for example, there's some research by Nalini Ambady, who used to be a professor in the psychology department here at Stanford, and so she conducted this, work with some collaborators, and they were looking at, how children receive this message of colorblindness, and so they took children who were in 4th grade and in 5th grade, and they gave them one of 2 messages. Either they told them that we care about racial equality, and therefore we need to be colorblind, or they told them we care about racial equality, and therefore we need to value diversity. So 2 really different messages of ways to get to the same point, basically. And so then they had these children, they exposed them to this incident where there was a child who knocked a black soccer player down on the soccer field. And they asked that child, why did you do that? And I think he punched him or something. And he said, I did it because he was black. So, pretty blatant, right? And black people are aggressive, and so I just punched him before he punched me, something like that. And so the vast majority of the children who were in this valuing diversity condition thought that was a sign of discrimination. They coded that, okay, that's discriminatory. But only half of the students who were in this colorblind condition actually saw that as discrimination. And in fact, when they repeated it, they sort of told their teachers basically what happened in this situation. They repeated it in such a way that the teachers didn't feel like it was much of a problem, and the teachers felt like they would not intervene in that situation.
Even though the act was explicitly framed by the person doing it as
exactly
racially motivated.
Yeah, but if they're listening to the retelling of it, of a child who was told be colorblind, they didn't see a problem with it. So this is an issue, right? Because if you're telling children to be colorblind because you care about racial bias, you care about equity, you care about discrimination, right? It's actually having the opposite effect, where people are less protected, right? The teachers are less inclined to get involved. So you're leaving people more exposed to the things that you're concerned about. So it's not the panacea that that people have been taught that it is. And so that's one of the, so all the strategies I put up there, all the situational triggers and so forth, that's not one of them. I mean, that's not to be colorblind is not one of the ways that that you can approach this and expect always to have good outcomes come from it.
Yeah. Do you remember what you told your son on the plane?
Well, yeah. I mean, I described it. I mean, I could have left it alone and thought, oh, okay. I'm not going to get into it because he's 5, But, I confronted him.
Yeah.
I asked him, what are you thinking?
Yeah.
What are you doing? Why are you thinking this? I interrogated him.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I did that because I wanted him to learn how to reflect on these things. I wanted him to think, well, why was I thinking that, right? I wanted him to think that because, and when I'm not there, right? I want him to think about this on his own, to learn how to interrogate his own mind on his own, especially around these issues. And I feel like, it's never too young to, and especially if children are out there and they're seeing this, they're absorbing all of this, sort of not helping them through it is not helping them.
Yeah, it's almost like by ignoring it, you're increasing the likelihood they'll perpetuate those same behaviors and attitudes. I mean, I think it's certainly children sometimes might not be completely aware of why they're behaving the way they are. But as you just showed us, neither are adults, right? And
Yeah.
it seems like a lot of this process of, we're talking about leading us all towards freedom from bias is this increased awareness. I guess, you talked beautifully about the way that organizations like Nextdoor or even police departments can sort of systematize that type of awareness, that
Yeah.
type of slowing down. I
Yeah.
think a lot of us feel that in this cultural moment, we ourselves are speeding up
Yeah.
more than ever.
We are.
And it's a difficult thing to, a lot of us take meditation classes just because we're so bad at slowing down these
Yeah.
days. What,
Yeah.
what message do you have just to someone in the audience, someone reading the book who's just saying, okay, police officers need this, neighbors need this. What do I do? What's my own personal checklist when I'm in the middle of an emotional, rapid fire moment to
Yeah.
slow myself down?
Yeah, I think awareness of where bias is most likely to creep up is really important. And when you have that awareness, you can kind of try to counteract it. So that awareness gives us some power over it. We do have some power over our sort of social environment, right, or situation. And so I think that awareness is important, and sort of taking the steps that you need, right, to almost like the time and the distance, right, that you need to figure it out. I think that's important, and I think that our organizations and our institutions have a special responsibility here, because they control the social environment for a lot of us, right? Our workplaces, there are people, in those workplaces controlling the social environment for lots of people. Nextdoor is in 95% of the neighborhoods in the US right now, 95%. So when they add a checklist to slow people down, that's millions of minds, that's millions of people who are affected by that. And so that's huge responsibility. So that is a huge lever for change, really.
That's amazing. And I guess that sort of reminds me of another thing that I was thinking about hearing your talk, and that I often get talking about my own work in trying to build empathy as well, where, obviously we're psychologists, so we think about the insides of people's minds and how that affects their behavior. And when we look for solutions and for problems, we look inside the individual, right? We think, okay, bias is occurring because of the way that I'm seeing things or the way that I'm experiencing things. And if I could sort of help to adjust that, then I could reduce my own bias. But I guess one critique that I often hear, not of your work, but of mine, is that, okay, great, well, if one person at a time changes, that's terrific, but some of the problems that we have are not about the individual, they're about the structures around us. So, if people were to follow your advice and sort of take off, let's say that they were able to take off the glasses of their own bias and see things clearly, they might be less biased, they might be less prone to acting in unjust ways, but they'd still see around them a world that perpetuates injustice and bias through the very structures that we have. Our hiring, as you said, our hiring practices, our policing practices, our educational practices. Is this really a problem that can be solved from the individual out? Or is it something that needs more attention in terms of the structures that we have? Do those work hand in hand?
They work hand in hand. You definitely need to think about and focus on the structural issues. That's how we get the bias in our head, right? It's from, being out in the world and seeing disparities and sort of making sense of those disparities, the narratives that we tell ourselves, the narratives that are cultural narratives that we tell ourselves, right? So there's all this out there, right, that's affecting us, our what's going on inside. And so you can't, so when you're looking at individuals, you're also kind of looking at society in a way. And I also think, so people kind of almost make a false choice, like, okay, either we can solve this problem by, looking at individual bias, or we can solve this problem by looking at the structural stuff, and maybe the structural stuff is more important. I think we need to look at all different levels of this, right? We need to, be sort of thinking about, both the structural stuff and how that's affecting our minds, but we also need to be thinking about how our own biases are creating those structures, right? Our own biases are influencing, like I talked about, sort of what policies we endorse, how they influence police practice, how they influence systems. And so I feel like we need to be at all levels on this. I mean, it's a big problem, and it's a kind of multifaceted approach to addressing it.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that the awareness that you're creating and the sort of ways that leaders in all of these different spaces are catching on is really is a powerful opportunity for that type of change.
Yeah.
We're gonna move to some questions from the audience.
Okay.
Okay, so here we go. What roles does media play in either triggering or helping to mitigate bias? Can exposure to positive representations, even fictional, be as fruitful as in-person contact? What about the opposite? I suppose negative representations.
Yeah, so yeah, media, can play a big role in all of this, and sort of, that's like in addition to the disparities that we're seeing out the world that we've been talking quite a bit about, there's also the media that we're like absorbing, and sort of what are we absorbing when we take that in. And sort of positive, role models in the media could be helpful, but there's, research by Nalini Ambady, again, our former colleague, who did a really famous study where, they looked at even, people who were in these positive roles, so African Americans who were in, sort of strong positive roles in, these sitcoms that people would watch, right? And they found that even when they were in these roles, if you looked at how the other actors on the set were viewing that person, remember? You just look at their nonverbals, and they found that there were more negative nonverbal behavior that was directed at the black actor, say, than the white actor. And not only did they find like sort of bias in this way on the set, right? They found that it was contagious. And so people who watched these shows like CSI Miami, and it was like a bunch of shows like this where millions, I think they looked at shows where over 11 million people would tune into on a weekly basis in the US and watch these shows, right? And they found that the people who watched the shows actually would catch the bias. And so the more they watched those shows and the more they watched these sort of negative nonverbal, so this is really subtle stuff, right? They actually, it increased their bias. So the media is a big deal, but I don't want to like blame everything on the media. I feel like we have a tendency to do that a lot, that it's all about that, and if we change that, things would be okay. I mean, I feel like a lot of it is us, and so I think we need to own that. I can tell you another story about one of my sons when he was how old was he? He was in first grade, and he asked me, he says, "Mommy, do you think that people feel a different kind of way about black people than white people?" And I said, well, why would you say that? And he says, well, I don't know. He said, I just feel like there's something different. And I said, well, give me an example. So he thought about it, and he says, oh, well, you remember we were at the Safeway the other day? And I said, yeah. And he says, remember, there was a black man who walked in. Now, we lived in a mostly white neighborhood. We were in that Safeway. I remember when the black man walked in, actually. Wow. And he said, well, when he walked in, he said, the people kind of stayed away from him a little bit. And he said it was almost like he had a giant force field around him. He was really into Star Wars back then. He said, yeah, it was like he had a giant force field around him. And when he went to stand in the line, his was the shortest line for a long time. People weren't getting behind him. And I said, wow. I said, well, what do you think that means? And he says, I don't know. And he was thinking about it, and he was thinking about it. And then he looked at me, and he says, I think it's fear. And I said, wow. And this was at Thanksgiving time, and I was putting the turkey in the oven when he said that, and I burned my hand on the oven. And I was like, wow, if a first grader can tell us that, right? And this is all looking at us, looking at how we move through the world, right? They can determine what social status is. They can determine how we're regarded. They can make sense of it, right? I mean, that's a child's job, is to understand what correlates with what.
Yeah.
And they're good at it.
Yeah.
And they're good at watching us. And I tell you, I had that burn on my hand for a year after that conversation. And every time I looked at my hand, I would think about that conversation.
Yeah, wow. And I mean, you know, what we see, whether it's right in front of us or in the media, can sort of create these beliefs that we have, and then we put out into the world, like you said, like the contagion that Nalini found in this TV show. I mean, I remember growing up, my father's from Pakistan, and sort of seeing the representation of Arabic people and Muslims like him as sort of like the bad guys in all of these like 1980s and 1990s action movies. It was weird for me, because I knew that as an audience member, I was supposed to root against them.
Yeah.
I was like, oh, I'm kind of rooting against my dad here. Anyways, I mean, do you think that the opposite? So I guess the question also was about what can people in media do? I mean, is there evidence about really, you know, positive qualities or positive effects of representation in the other way? You know, sort of positive, sort of counter-stereotypical, for instance, representation.
Yeah. They can do nothing. No, I'm just kidding.
It's only harm. No, no good, yeah.
I'm just kidding. I mean, there's a lot of people who are actually taking up the cause right now. I mean, so, you know, there are a lot of people in the entertainment industry who are trying to, what they call, change the narrative, right? They're trying to use their positions to, you know, help people to see people, and to see people in different ways, in multifaceted ways, so that you don't have these sort of, you know, sort of one-sided images that kind of make people out to be the enemy. And so they use, you know, comedy, you know, they're using drama, they're using sort of all these different ways to tell stories, right? So that, so actually to increase empathy, you know, which is what you do, right?
Try to. What we do, actually. Yeah. Okay, here's a topical question from the audience. With the upcoming Democratic primary in California, 2 weeks away-ish, what should we look for in candidates that will disrupt bias and support criminal justice reform?
Ooh.
An easy one, yeah, simple. 5 words or less.
I don't know. Well, Michael Bloomberg has been in the news lately, so stop and frisk is now in the news again. And, you know, you saw what we found, you know, in New York with stop and frisk and support of it. And I don't know, it's interesting. There are a lot of people, especially people of color in New York, who are really upset about, you know, how he's moving up in the polls, and moving up with a lot of African Americans too, who were not New Yorkers. And I think they feel that, you know, he did a lot of harm, and recognized that harm, but was insensitive to it. So yeah, so that's a problem. But on you know, on the other hand, well, actually maybe not on the other hand, on the same hand, knowing that he was tough on crime, and sort of knowing about the disparities in crime could actually improve his electability for some people. And so, what do you do with that? So it's difficult. I mean, I think there are a lot of people who are focused on criminal justice reform now. It's one of the few, you know, areas where we have bipartisan support sometimes for some of those issues. And so it's a moment in time where things can happen. And you know, there are lots of people in various spaces who are trying to think about what should happen, you know, in terms of mass incarceration, in terms of bail reform. You know, there are a lot of people who were, and even I was at a conference at Stanford earlier today, and it was all about transforming prosecution, right? So prosecutors are now trying to figure out, well, what are they doing that could participate in the perpetuation of these racial disparities? And they're trying to figure out how to evaluate their own systems, right, to deal with this.
There's another question from the audience that's pertinent to this, which is, what can we do as individuals if we want to fight against sort of unjust mass incarceration and contribute to sort of to reform of this system? Besides, I suppose, voting for whichever candidate we think is doing that in the,
Well, there's voting. I mean, there's, just sort of like policy choices, being more aware of what those policies do and sort of how they affect people and sort of why, how they're created and what the motivation is, all of that. I think, that's important. I don't know. I mean, I feel like we can do more than we realize. Oftentimes we feel helpless, like we can't do anything, and what can we do to change a system? But I mean, there's a lot we can do. I'm not a sworn police officer, but so I and a number of my colleagues who are sitting right here, I should say, Hazel Marcus and Mariam Hamadani, we've been working, together to try to, help a department think about their policies, think about the disparities that, that result from those policies. I'll give you an example that I didn't talk about when I was at the podium, but we were brought in actually to help the police department in their reform efforts, and this is. They've been under federal. Well, you're looking at the time. I know it's going to take a long time. Yeah, they've been under federal oversight for 17 years. So there's a lot I could say, but I won't say in the interest of time. But anyway, so we were brought in to help with that, and but we're not. We're not sworn off, but we were brought in as scientists. We were brought in as people who could help them to, analyze data. We were brought in as people who could help them to develop metrics, like we did with this Intel led. And so, I don't know. There's a lot that we can do in the spaces that we're in that we don't realize. We don't always recognize our power. I mean, in Oakland, for example, they made changes to the handcuffing policy. They made changes to the search policy. They made like real changes, at the, urging and after like discussion, with people who were looking at this from the outside. And so I just, I don't know, I feel like we can do more.
Yeah. I guess with that in mind, so you probably don't remember this, but you spoke at Columbia when I was a graduate student there, and I'll never forget it. Yeah, I was really such a powerful moment for many of the students in the department, and I remember feeling like I was so disheartened by some of the data that you showed, just the hugely pervasive, just millisecond level bias that people have, and you showed the death penalty choice data, which was just, it was just so heartbreaking and devastating, and it made me angry and sad, and you didn't seem that way. You seemed like you were optimistic, and I think that was one of the things that always inspired me about you and your work. And I guess I want to ask, you started your talk by saying that Americans feel like it's worse than it has been for a long time. I certainly resonate with that feeling. Do you still feel optimistic? Do you feel more or less optimistic than you did, back then? And how do you see your sort of, how do you see the future unfolding, and how do you feel about it?
Yeah, I mean, I still do actually feel optimistic. I mean, I think in the face of it all, like we need to keep the optimism, to keep going. I mean, otherwise, it's really difficult. Yeah. And for me, people oftentimes will ask me, well, your work is so depressing. How do you keep from being depressed? And I actually feel like, I don't know, the ability to take an issue that people care a lot about and put that under the microscope and investigate that, right? And to try to understand what's really going on. Yeah. I find that really empowering. I find the science actually empowering. And I guess even after writing the book, and that's for me, in writing the book, I realized that other people find the science empowering. I talked to you a little bit about, Tiffany Crutcher. So she is the twin sister of the man who was shot and killed by the police in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And she read a chapter of the book that was partly about her brother and her family, and she read that to her parents, and she said that they just sat in the room and they cried, and they cried because they felt like they never thought about science as a way to give answers or direction, and in reading that and sort of thinking about it, they felt like, I don't know, there was hope with the science, right? Yeah. There was hope there for understanding, well, how do these things happen? How do we move forward? And I don't know, when she was telling me that, I just thought for the first time, I had always thought about science as just information, right? That you're giving, but for them, it was soothing, the idea that science can soothe. I learned from writing the book and from meeting all these people that I met and writing the book, and that gives me hope, just knowing that there's something I can do. It gives me hope knowing that there are all these people out there who care, who are fighting, the good fight to do things, to make things better. So yeah, I guess, yeah, I'm not pessimistic.
Yeah, and I think that the work that you have shown us and that you're doing gives us reason to stay hopeful, even in a difficult circumstance. So I think we should probably wrap up now, but I just want to thank you again, and please let's thank Jennifer for this amazing presentation.
Thank you. Thank you. Should I go outside?
Yeah. And Jennifer, you'll be outside to sign books if people want to?
Yeah, I'll be right in the lobby area, I think.
Terrific.
So thank you all again for
everyone.
coming.